There's an island in the middle of the Caribbean Sea where the people hold US passports, travel freely to the US mainland, and serve in the US military at a rate higher than many states. But they cannot vote for president. They have no voting representative in the US Congress. And when the biggest disaster in the island's modern history struck, in the first 9 days after the hurricane, survivors in Texas and Florida received nearly $100 million in federal aid, while Puerto Ricans received just over $6 million. This is Puerto Rico. And the real question isn't why this island is failing. The real question is why a territory that's called a part of America is caught in a trap that no one can seem to escape, not its people, not its local politicians, not even well-intentioned people in Washington. The answer isn't as simple as many people think. It doesn't lie entirely with American policy, even though that policy has serious problems. Nor does it lie entirely with local governance, though corruption in Puerto Rico is real and well documented. To understand Puerto Rico, you have to start at the foundation. And the foundation of everything, as is so often the case in history, is geography. If you look at a map of the Atlantic and follow the great chain of islands stretching across the Caribbean, you'll see Cuba, Jamaica, and then Hispaniola, the island shared by Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And at the easternmost edge of that chain, more than 1,636 kilometers southeast of Miami, is Puerto Rico. The distance from Miami to Puerto Rico is about the same as the distance from New York to Miami. This is not a nearby island. This is a piece of land deep in the Atlantic Ocean. But what's important isn't the distance. What's important is the location. Puerto Rico sits exactly where the open Atlantic meets the Caribbean Sea. Just to the west of the island is the Mona Passage, a channel more than 140 kilometers wide that separates Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic. The Mona Passage is one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, connecting the Atlantic Ocean to the Panama Canal and the entire Western Seas. Whoever controls that waterway controls a huge portion of the commercial flow between continents. That has made Puerto Rico a target that every great empire in modern history has coveted. But the strategic location is only half the story. The island's internal topography has created deeper fractures that still affect every aspect of life today. If you stand on the coast of San Juan and look inland, you won't see a flat tropical plain. You will see mountains. Puerto Rico is split from east to west by the Cordillera Central, a massive mountain range that rises straight from the coast. The highest peak, Cerro de Punta, reaches over 1,300 meters. That mountain range creates a distinct climate divide. The north is humid and lush because it catches the rain-carrying trade winds. The south is arid, almost semi-desert, because it lies in the mountain range's rain shadow. That topographical divide meant that throughout history, transporting goods from the coffee plantations and farms in the highlands down to the coastal ports was an infrastructure problem with no good solution. It forced the population to concentrate densely along the narrow coastal plains, especially around San Juan in the north. And that very concentration has made the island extremely vulnerable whenever a hurricane strikes. There's nowhere to retreat. The mountains hold back the water. Floods pour down into the crowded cities. Puerto Rico isn't a single island either. It's an archipelago of more than 140 smaller islands. To the east are Vieques and Culebra, islands with pristine beaches that bear the scars of decades of use by the US military as a weapons and bombing range. To the west is the desolate Mona Island, which biologists compare to the Galapagos Islands for its unique biodiversity. And just off the northern coast of the main island, beneath the water's surface, is something that makes Puerto Rico terrifying in a completely different way. Running parallel to the northern coast is the Puerto Rico Trench, the deepest point in the entire Atlantic Ocean. At its deepest point, a place called the Milwaukee Deep, the ocean floor drops more than 8,300 meters. If you were to drop Mount Everest in there, its peak would still be submerged by more than 1,600 meters of water. That massive trench exists because Puerto Rico sits on the boundary between two tectonic plates, the Caribbean plate and the North American plate. These two plates are grinding against each other, creating a subduction zone that subjects the island to frequent earthquakes. In 2020, a series of earthquakes destroyed thousands of homes on the south side of the island, forcing many families to sleep outdoors for weeks. That is the geographical portrait of Puerto Rico, an island in a key maritime position, divided by a mountain range, surrounded by deep seas, and perched on two colliding tectonic plates. This geography lays the foundation for everything that follows. But geography is not the only answer. Geography is just the starting point. What people decide to do with that land is what creates the tragedy, and that story begins with the name its first people gave it. Before the Spanish arrived, before the Americans arrived, the island had a name of its own. The Taino, the island's indigenous inhabitants, called it Borican, meaning the land of the valiant lords. They were not a small tribe. They were a complex civilization that had mastered the Caribbean for centuries. When Christopher Columbus first landed in 1493 on his second voyage, the Taino had built large villages, sophisticated agricultural systems, and a rich culture. They played a ceremonial game on stone courts called Beatty. The ruins of those courts still exist today, a quiet reminder. The Spanish came for gold, and they found it in the rivers of Borican. They renamed the island San Juan Bautista. The main trading port became Puerto Rico, which means rich port. Then, through a strange clerical error that has gone down in history, the two names switched places. The island became Puerto Rico, and the capital became San Juan. What happened next was a genocide by several different means. Forced labour in the gold mines, warfare, and above all, the smallpox and measles the Europeans unwittingly brought with them caused the Taino population to collapse at a horrifying rate. By 1520, Spain declared the Taino to be extinct. It was a political declaration, not a biological reality. Modern DNA research has proven otherwise. The Taino did not disappear. They retreated into the mountainous interior, mixing their blood with poor Spanish farmers and the enslaved Africans on the sugar plantations. Today, the average Puerto Rican carries mitochondrial DNA that traces back to those Taino women. The culture was not erased. It was buried, and it lived on in its own way. For the next 400 years, Puerto Rico was a military outpost that Spain held onto mainly for its strategic value, not out of any concern for its residents. While other colonies in the Americas rose up for their independence in the 19th century, Puerto Rico remained one of the last two wings of the Spanish Empire in the Caribbean, along with Cuba. Then a new empire appeared to the north and changed everything. In 1898, the United States declared war on Spain after the USS Maine sank in Havana Harbor. Washington claimed it was fighting to liberate Cuba. But when the US Navy began shelling San Juan in May of 1898, they weren't there to liberate anyone. On July 25th, 1898, 1,300 American infantrymen landed on the coast of Guanica in the southwest. Many Puerto Ricans, tired after centuries of Spanish neglect, welcomed them. They believed that America would bring true democracy and equal rights. It was a misunderstanding that Puerto Ricans would live with for more than a century. When the Treaty of Paris was signed at the end of 1898, Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the United States as a spoil of war. Puerto Ricans were not invited to the negotiating table. They were not consulted. They were simply handed over from one imperial power to another. That created a legal problem for Washington. The US Constitution has no clear provision for holding permanent colonies. The United States was founded as a republic, not an empire. So, the Supreme Court invented an unprecedented legal solution. In a series of rulings known as the Insular Cases, the court declared Puerto Rico belonging to, but not a part of, the United States. The territory was described as being inhabited by alien races incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon principles of law. That legal ambiguity meant the Constitution didn't fully apply. Congress could do whatever it wanted with the island without having to follow its usual constraints. The first thing they did was try to forcefully Americanize the population. They changed the island's name to Puerto Rico, a misspelling that lasted until 1932. They mandated English instruction in schools, firing teachers who taught in Spanish. That program failed because the cultural resistance was too strong. So instead, Washington decided to turn the island into the most profitable economic hub it could. And this is where the story gets complicated in a way few videos are willing to confront. Because Puerto Rico's problem wasn't created just by Washington. And it wasn't created just by Puerto Ricans either. It's the product of a system that both sides helped build. One where each bad decision by one party created the conditions for a bad decision by the other. Let's start with what Washington did. The first iron bar of the cage was forged in 1920. It's called the Jones Act, or formerly the Merchant Marine Act of 1920. The act requires all goods shipped by sea between two US ports to be carried on US, flagged US, built US, owned and US crewed ships. The original goal was to support the shipping industry after World War I. For an island that imports over 85% of its food and consumer goods, this act creates a burden unlike that of any mainland state. Imagine how this works in practice. A cargo ship from Asia carrying electronics to the US East Coast might sail right past Puerto Rico. But that ship can't stop in San Juan to unload. The goods must be taken to a mainland US port, unloaded, then reloaded onto a much more expensive American ship, and only then be brought back to Puerto Rico. That absurd administrative detour creates an invisible tax on everything. The Cato Institute estimates the Jones Act costs the Puerto Rican economy about $1.4 billion per year, which is over $200 per person per year. It costs twice as much to ship a container from the US mainland to Puerto Rico as it does to ship that same container to the neighbouring Dominican Republic. This means a non-US neighbour gets access to cheaper goods than Puerto Ricans, even though Puerto Ricans are US citizens. The second bar was put in place in 1976, but this time in a more subtle way. Section 936 of the Internal Revenue Code allowed US manufacturing companies to operate in Puerto Rico without paying federal corporate taxes on their profits. Pharmaceutical and tech corporations flocked to the island. Puerto Rico became the leading manufacturing hub of the Caribbean. The middle class expanded, the economy boomed. It was the first time in modern history that Puerto Rico looked like it was on a path to real prosperity. Then in 1996, the US Congress decided to balance the federal budget and deemed Section 936 a wasteful corporate giveaway. They voted to repeal it with a 10-year phase-out period ending in 2006. When the tax breaks expired, the factories didn't slowly scale back. They fled almost overnight. Tens of thousands of high-paying jobs vanished. The tax base collapsed. Puerto Rico entered an economic recession in 2006 that has never really ended. In that desperate situation, the Puerto Rican government began issuing bonds to pay its bills. And Wall Street loved them. Because of a special quirk in US law, Puerto Rican bonds were triple tax exempt, free from local, state, and federal taxes. Investors scrambled to buy them, and the government borrowed more and more to cover the gap left by the shrinking economy. By 2015, the debt had ballooned to over $70 billion. But this is the third bar of the cage, and it's the cruelest one. In 1984, an obscure provision was added to a federal bill that specifically excluded Puerto Rico from Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection. An American state in financial crisis can declare bankruptcy, restructure its debt, and start over. Puerto Rico could not. It was legally forbidden, trapped with a mountain of debt and no legal tools to deal with it. By 2016, the US Congress stepped in to intervene, but not with a bailout. They created a financial oversight and management board, which locals call La Junta. 7 presidentially appointed, unelected members were given the final say over Puerto Rico's budget. They slashed pensions, closed hundreds of schools, and drained resources from the University of Puerto Rico, all in the name of ensuring Wall Street creditors got paid. But this is where the story has to get more honest about a second side that many people don't want to look at. Because Washington isn't the only villain in this story. And acknowledging that doesn't mean excusing America's terrible policies. It means looking at the truth squarely to understand why the problem is so hard to solve. Puerto Rico has a history of internal governance filled with deep cracks. Economic dependence on capital from Washington, combined with a large public sector, created a fertile environment for political corruption to grow over decades. The Puerto Rico Electric Power Authority, PREPA, is the most telling example. Once seen as a triumph of effective public management for bringing electricity to remote areas private companies wouldn't serve, PREPA gradually became politicized as both parties took turns appointing their own people to leadership positions, regardless of competence. Ultimately, it was the agency whose power grid completely collapsed when Hurricane Maria arrived. In 2019, a leak of 889 pages of chat messages from Governor Ricardo Rosselló and his inner circle ignited the largest uprising in Puerto Rico's modern history. In those messages, they joked about the bodies piling up after Hurricane Maria. They shared confidential government information with lobbyists. They showed signs of steering contracts to political allies. Hundreds of thousands of Puerto Ricans took to the streets. The governor was forced to resign. It was a moment when the people made it clear they weren't just tired of Washington, but also tired of their own politicians. A brain drain made everything worse. As the economy declined after 2006, the most educated and skilled Puerto Ricans began migrating to the US mainland, where they had full citizenship and better job opportunities. After Hurricane Maria in 2017, that wave surged, including doctors and engineers. The government needed its most capable people to rebuild, but those very people were leaving the island. Puerto Rico's population fell from about 3.8 million people in 2000 to around 3.2 million by the early 2020s, an island losing the very people who could save it. So, this is the fuller picture of what happened. Geography laid the foundation by making Puerto Rico a coveted strategic target. Colonial history turned it into an asset to be transferred without its residents' consent. The US legal system built the Jones Act, repealed Section 936, and blocked the path to bankruptcy. At the same time, weak local governance and corruption deepened the cracks that system created. These two forces didn't exist in parallel by accident. They fed off each other in a cycle that was very difficult to break. And then, on September 20th, 2017, Hurricane Maria made landfall on the island. The Category 4 hurricane, with wind gusts of 240 kilometers per hour, did not discriminate. The island's entire power grid collapsed. 95% of cell towers lost their signal. 43% of wastewater treatment plants stopped operating. Roads disappeared under landslides and fallen trees. Hospitals lost power and depended on generators that were running out of fuel. People didn't die from the wind. They died because there was no electricity to run ventilators. They died because they couldn't refrigerate their injectable medications. They died because there was no way to contact emergency services. Puerto Rico initially reported 65 deaths after the hurricane, but that was the number from the immediate aftermath. A later study by George Washington University estimated nearly 3,000 excess deaths, a number that later became the official figure. In the first 9 days after Hurricane Harvey hit Texas and Irma hit Florida, survivors in those two places received nearly $100 million from FEMA. In the first 9 days after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, that figure was just over $6 million. It wasn't because Puerto Rico suffered less damage than Texas or Florida. It wasn't because Hurricane Maria was weaker. It was because this is a territory with no seat in Congress, no vote in the presidential election, and no political leverage to force Washington to act faster. The power outage after Hurricane Maria lasted for 11 months, the longest in American history. And when the power was finally restored, the flaws of PREPA, the power authority that had been politicized for decades, were once again laid completely bare. In 2022, Hurricane Fiona, with only a fraction of Maria's strength, knocked out power to the entire island again. The grid was still too fragile to withstand it. But here is the most remarkable thing in this whole story. Before dawn on September 20th, 2017, before the hurricane arrived, there were small communities in Puerto Rico that had decided not to wait for any government. In Agentas, a small mountain town, a community organisation called Casa Pueblo had been quietly installing solar panels for years. When the hurricane hit and the national grid collapsed, Casa Pueblo still had power. They became a relief centre for the entire region. They charged people's phones so they could call their loved ones. They showed movies at night to help children feel less afraid in the dark. That model has spread. After Hurricane Maria, the community solar movement in Puerto Rico exploded, not because of encouraging government policies, but because people no longer trusted the centralised grid. They built independent power systems at the scale of families, neighbourhoods, and even larger communities. It was an infrastructure revolution that grew from the bottom up, not from the top down. Culturally, Puerto Rico is exporting its spirit globally in ways that no political map can capture. Puerto Rican music, art, and food are shaping global pop culture. The Puerto Rican community on the US mainland, which is already larger than the island's population, is increasingly returning to invest in and build support networks for their homeland. A younger generation is rejecting the traditional political division between the two major parties that have taken turns in power without creating real change. They are building new political movements and demanding a kind of accountability that the previous generation never dared to demand. Today, the question of Puerto Rico's future remains open in very fundamental ways. The issue of its political status, whether to become the 51st US state, become an independent nation, or continue as a freely associated territory, is still deeply debated within the Puerto Rican community itself. Referendums have been held multiple times, and the results have never been clear enough to compel Washington to act. Because in the American political system, territories without electoral college votes always have less of a voice than the states that do. This is the ultimate paradox of Puerto Rico. This island was once so important that empires fought over its control. But once it was in the hands of a superpower, it became not important enough to be treated as an equal. Geography made it a target. History made it a colony. The legal system made it a debtor unable to save itself. And poor governance at both the federal and local levels has ensured that every crisis is worse than it has to be. But if Puerto Rico's history teaches us anything, it's this. You can colonize a land, you can build legal systems that keep it in the dark, but what rises from beneath, from the small communities installing solar panels in the mountains, from the young people refusing to play by the old rules, from a culture rooted too deeply to ever be pulled out, that cannot be controlled by any law the US Congress can pass. The small island at the eastern edge of the Greater Antilles is still there, still quiet between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, still sitting on the boundary of two colliding tectonic plates, still enduring the burdens that history has heaped upon it. But it is also, day by day, rewriting its own story in a way that no one else can.